Welcome to our look at the origin of life. In order to talk about the beginning of life, we probably need to talk about the beginning of the earth and what that might have been like. So let's get started. Before we jump into the conditions on the early earth, I do want to remind you we are approaching this from a scientific perspective. That's what we are limited to in this class. In biology, we are limited to looking at hypotheses that can actually be tested, testable hypotheses, and those are limited to hypotheses that are about the natural world, not supernatural things outside of our normal everyday matter, energy type of experience. Okay, so our scientific focus is on those kinds of things that are testable and of the natural world. Now, based on the evidence that we have, that scientists have, and granted, it's somewhat limited, because there's not a whole lot of rocks left from the early Earth. Those are pretty special to find, but based on what evidence we do have, we are pretty sure there was no life on the earliest Earth. Why not? Because the conditions on the infant Earth really could not possibly support life, at least not life as we recognize it. So what was the early Earth like then? The early Earth, as the Earth coalesced from what would look to us perhaps like asteroids and dust and rocks and things crashing into each other as they orbited the sun, it would be this molten mass of violently accumulated rock that is very unstable, undergoing lots of volcanic eruptions. When you have lots of volcanic eruptions, we see this even with our eruptions that occur today, lots of lightning is involved, so there's this lots of energy in the atmosphere. Additionally, our planet was being bombarded with meteorites constantly. Again, it is thought that the solar system was formed from this rotating cloud of rock and dust, and the rock and dust would have been flying into the planet at extremely high volume. Additionally, there was limited atmosphere, no ozone, so the radiation striking the planet from the sun would have been intense UV radiation, so again, more energy coming into the planet. And the atmosphere was not pleasant. The atmosphere that existed was nothing like our atmosphere that we have today. Methane, this rotten eggs smelling nasty stuff, methane gas, ammonia. Imagine walking around in ammonia gas. If you've ever opened a bottle of ammonia, you know what that would smell like. Hydrogen gas, nitrogen gas, which we still have out here in large amounts today, nitrogen anyway. Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. Extremely different from what we have and extremely hostile to life, at least our type of life. Okay? Now, life somehow had to arise out of that beginning, of very inhospitable beginning of the planet. Scientists refer to this as abiogenesis, meaning there was no life, but somehow life did arise here. Today, we know that life comes from life. Cells beget other cells. But in the beginning of the earth, there were no cells present. How did the first cells come to arise if there was no life? So abiogenesis just means the beginning of life from non-life, okay? So life arising from non-living matter, okay? So if Earth was inhospitable to life and there was no life, that means some kind of transition from non-life to life had to occur at some point in the Earth's history, and probably reasonably early in the Earth's history, and as we understand it. Now, assuming that life did not just poof here in one instant, fully formed as we see it, or even in simpler forms, but fully formed. It must have arisen in steps. This idea of going from simple to complex life forms is one that the fossil record concretely and emphatically supports. The fossil record shows us that life went from simple to more complex forms. So if that is the case, what might those steps have been? The steps might have been, it is hypothesized, something like this. And again, nobody was there, nobody could write it down, but scientists suggest that since there was no life, there were first simple inorganic chemicals. Remember, we've talked about inorganic, small, simple, lacking lots of carbon, hydrogen, big molecular combinations. So we are talking those things that we were mentioning in the atmosphere earlier: nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, things like that, okay? But from those inorganic chemicals, at some point, we had to get the more complex organic building blocks that we are familiar with, like amino acids and all that. We can't have life without the bricks that life is made of. So we had to go from inorganic, extremely simple compounds to more complex organic monomers, like the amino acids, the nucleotides, things like that. And from organic monomers to organic polymers, where we're going to have bigger, more complicated compounds. Then some cell-like things, little packets of these materials. Heredity, some way to get the instructions for making successful cell-like things from one generation to the next. And ultimately, once you have that, you are talking first life. So down here, we've got the first living things, prokaryotic cells. So these are the steps that, in general, are the topic of conversation among scientists who study this kind of stuff. So, what was present on the early Earth then? As best we can tell, just inorganic chemicals early. It was just too violent, too hot, too everything for there to be anything but simple inorganic compounds. So the first leap that needed to be made was going from these simple inorganic compounds to more highly organized organic monomers, like amino acids, like nucleotides, and things like that. How could we get, from simple little tiny atoms and molecules to these more complex monomers, okay? Well, as inhospitable to life as early Earth almost certainly was, those conditions may have been just what was required to get that very first step, the inorganic to organic, going for the creation of those building blocks of life. Remember, building blocks, amino acids, nucleotides, and those kinds of things, okay? In the creation of those first monomers, the early Earth's very hostile, nasty atmosphere may have been key. At least that's what these two guys, Oparin and Haldane, thought in the 1920s, okay? They said that the early Earth's atmosphere, with all this ammonia and methane and so on, was a reducing and not an oxidizing, like it is today, atmosphere. Okay? Now, what does that mean? Let's have a little quick chemistry review. Reducing versus oxidizing. Please remember, to reduce means a substance is having electrons added to it. If you're adding something to me, why are we calling it reducing? Because, of course, if you'll recall, adding electrons to something means you're adding negative charges, and that means you're reducing the charge on the molecule. So reduction means you're adding electrons, which means you are adding energy, because electrons are the little energy carriers for matter. And if you are doing that, it is a building process. When you are reducing a molecule, you are adding energy to it, you can make it more complex. Okay, so this is conducive, this type of environment, a reducing environment that would be hospitable to this, would be conducive to making complex molecules. Oxidizing is the exact opposite. We're removing, stripping electrons from something, taking away energy. It's a breaking down process. This is what we have today. We have an oxidizing environment, and it is in fact conducive to breaking apart molecules, not building them up. Okay, so let's go back to this operon and Haldane, and normally it is operon who is associated with this more so, or at least his name is the one associated with this idea. So he said oxygen is electronegative, remember, and oxygen loves electrons and it strips them from other things. And when you have lots of oxygen present, like we do in today's atmosphere, it's really hard to build up molecules in that environment, at least without living things already present that can do that inside their own bodies and protect it from this oxygen environment. It's without life being already present, it is really hard in an oxygen-rich environment for molecules to spontaneously get more complex, because oxygen is constantly stripping the electrons away from molecules. So the thing about the early Earth's atmosphere, if you will recall, the thing that was conspicuously absent was oxygen. There was none of this evil electron stripping atom in the early Earth atmosphere, okay? Indeed, the chemicals that were there were highly conducive to a reducing atmosphere. They created an environment where it was very likely that molecules and atoms would combine in interesting ways. And it was conducive to creating complex molecules, not stripping them down. Very, very unlike our atmosphere today. So to understand how we could make that jump from the inorganic, very simple, to the organic monomers, which are more complex, we have to understand that the Earth's atmosphere wasn't like what it is today. And today, organic molecules do not just spontaneously combine from inorganic molecules in this environment, because oxygen is present and it doesn't allow that to happen. But in the early Earth atmosphere, it was very, very different. And that move not only could happen, but would have been likely to happen. So the Operon and Haldane hypothesis was, if you had the correct primordial soup of inorganic compounds, like what we've talked about in the early Earth atmosphere, plus that reducing atmosphere, no oxygen present, plus an energy supply. And remember, we've mentioned that before too. Volcanic eruptions created lightning in the atmosphere. The UV radiation was hitting the Earth very heavily. You would get, if you combined those three things, organic compounds spontaneously forming from inorganic ones, okay? Now remember, that is not life from non-life, okay? Just because we have amino acids and nucleotides and those kinds of things does not mean we have life. It means we have the building blocks that living things might be made from, okay? So that was in the 20s. In the 50s, two guys, Miller and Urey, mostly Stanley Miller, he was a grad student for this guy, finally tested this hypothesis. They finally tested it. So what did they do? They built this apparatus, and it looked something like this, though this is simplified. They had water in a glass chamber, okay, and it was heated, so we're going to apply heat to this a little bit, not superheat, but heated enough, and let it vaporize. So we got water vapor rising up this tube, and the water vapor is going to travel into an atmosphere chamber that had the same kinds of gases that Stanley Miller believed were in the primitive Earth atmosphere: methane, ammonia, those things we've talked about, and no oxygen. And in this, so the water and the primitive gases would combine in this chamber, and he would zap it with some electricity, like the lightning, for example, that might have been in the early Earth atmosphere. The materials here would cool and condense and kind of rain out of the atmosphere chamber and dribble down into the into what is kind of like a collecting chamber, a little mini ocean, if you will. And then after some time, they tested the water and other substances that collected here to see if in this chamber, with this energy and the combination of the water and the primitive atmospheric soup, if from all of that they got some basic monomers, some basic nucleotides, amino acids, and so on. And what formed? Indeed, they found that amino acids could be formed in this way. So it is Miller and Urey that are credited with showing that Oparin's hypothesis could have in fact occurred. At least it occurred in their conditions in the lab that they set up to be like the early Earths. If the early Earth is how they thought it was, then we could have gotten formation of organic monomers from really super simple inorganic compounds. And that's Stanley Miller with his apparatus. You can see the atmosphere chamber with the electrodes in there zapping the water vapor and the gas. That's his a real, no, not very great picture of his apparatus. Pretty complicated looking tubes and jars and things. All right. So there has been, in the years that came after Miller's experiment, some controversy. It is thought that early Earth really probably was not as reducing as he thought or Oparin thought back in the 20s, not as reducing at all. And so the idea is, well, if the atmosphere wasn't reducing, then maybe we couldn't have gotten organic monomers to form like that on the surface of the Earth. Where could we have gotten them then? So where could these organic molecules arise if the Earth was not as hospitable to their formation as we thought? The deep sea vents are thought to be a likely candidate for these first formations, organic compounds, as are perhaps that they were carried here on meteorites. Meteorites that have struck the Earth have been found to be extremely rich in amino acids, and not just the amino acids that commonly make up living things, but actually even additional amino acids that we don't normally find on Earth. So amino acids, as it turns out, are not unique to Earth. They travel to us from outer space as well. So that's kind of the idea about how we might have gotten organic monomers on the planet. We're going to stop now, and I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about what would come after them. All right, thanks for watching. Take care. We'll see you in the next podcast.